Welcome back to the Applied Leadership Podcast. My name is Blayne Smith. This is my partner, Brandon Young, and our job here is to at least try to answer your questions about leadership and management and life in general. Some questions don't really have clean answers, but we'll at least try to discuss them, and you can get an idea of where our perspective falls on some of this stuff. So let's dig into today's. Brandon, how you doing?
I am great. I'm doing very well. How are you today?
I'm good, man. I'm good. And we've got a juicy question today that admittedly, I don't exactly know how to describe it in very few words. And I definitely don't have an answer for it off the bat, but I'm looking forward to chatting about it with you. The question is basically, how do you know when you should be making a decision from your gut or through your head? In other words, like, how can you tell whether or not you should follow your intuition, or maybe you're just kind of trying to stay comfortable or go with what your preference is? And how can you know if you're overanalyzing something or trying to over-rationalize a decision versus just applying good, solid rigor to the decision-making process? And we think a lot about this. We talk a lot about this. And I'm not sure that there is a single answer here. So I'm just going to throw it on the table here and back up for a second and just see if you have any initial thoughts.
Yeah, well, my initial thought is I'm so glad that we are tackling such easy topics at the beginning of our podcast here. When I think about instincts or gut, I think about some advice that I got, and I think it was related to dating, quite honestly, many years ago. And it was my brother, my older brother. I'm the youngest of three. And he said to me, "You really suck at this. So whatever your gut instinct is, don't do that."
The old George Costanza. Just do the opposite.
Yeah. So, yes, we're very steeped in the Seinfeld. So I appreciated the clarity by which my older brother spoke those words to me, as older brothers tend to do, speak directly to their younger brothers. But I think this is a really difficult topic. And I think, as you said from the onset, this likely isn't going to be one where we're going to land on a specific destination or a specific framework, although we've thought a lot about frameworks in terms of how you develop some of those instincts or those trustworthy instincts, and we could talk a little bit about that. But as we intend to on this platform, I think we can just have an open and honest conversation about it. And the first thing I would say is it's really hard. It is really hard to know when your gut is leading you astray. And, and even just to start, like, what are we talking about when we say your gut? What does that actually mean? And it's really interesting. I'm, as you know, a biblical scholar, and, and a lot of times in ancient wisdom, you talk about the gut, similarly to how you talk about the heart. And these are seen as the centers of your volition, right? It's the center of your loci of your decision making, which makes it really difficult because in present parlance, when we talk about things like follow your heart, that's, I think, more viewed in terms of in an emotive construct. And so, I think heart, gut, all of these things kind of start to combine, and it makes me think very deeply about what do we mean when we say, I'm following my gut, because, I'll say this 1,000 times over, and I say it to my kids all the time. Look, God gave you a gut for a reason. If it's talking to you, you should probably listen. And at least pause and investigate what's going on and kind of interrogate that, right? Like, ask a question. So I think first and foremost, throwing this out on the table is just to acknowledge that you have a gut for a reason. It's neither good nor bad. It's probably indicative. It's probably like an indicator light in some perspective. And I would say the first thing is, if your gut's talking to you, it's probably an opportunity for you to press pause and just ask, at least gain some awareness and ask the question, what's going on here? Why is my gut talking to me?
Oh man, that's really good. So we could go down the rabbit hole here. I'll try to avoid it, but I mean, I think even now, through a lot of medical science and biology, people are starting to speak about having sort of two brains, or like the gut biome is actually sort of like a second brain for your body. And so it maybe is speaking to you in a way more like an analytical brain would. So I'm not an expert in that, so I don't want to dive too deep, but I think you do sort of have both. And one way I might think about it is, which one do you prefer to kind of start with and which one's checking the other? So I think some people might really love the spreadsheets and the analysis. And for those folks, I might say, sure, when it's time to make a decision, perhaps you get your pro con list out or your spreadsheet or whatever type of analytical tool you want to use, and get to as far as you can get with that, which usually won't be all the way to a hard, solid decision. And then check in with your gut and see, do I feel like, my gut, my heart is sort of, my intuition is aligning with where this is leading me? And if so, then you're probably on a good track. But if you feel like it's really, you're running afoul and you're saying, man, then the numbers are telling me one thing, but my gut is telling me something else, then I think you mentioned pressing the pause button. That's a good way to do it. And sort of where you go from there, maybe we can talk more about. But I think that's a way to approach it. And conversely, I would say if you're more of a lead with the gut person, and I like my spreadsheets, don't get me wrong, but I'm probably more of a intuitive decision maker. I might recommend to myself that when you need to make a difficult decision and you sort of feel your way into what you think is right or what you feel is right, but you're not sure, then maybe you pull out the pro con list. Maybe then you go to the spreadsheet or whatever you've got and say, this feels like the move here, but I probably want to check myself just to make sure I'm not fooling myself or just kind of running off with my intuition and not using both. So like everything we talk about, basically, it's not either or. It's going to be a both and how you mesh those two together, I think, is probably where you're going to come up with your individual best approach for this kind of thing.
Yeah, something you said there that I really like and I want to call attention to is when you say I make my decisions more based on my intuition. I'm very much similar in that regard. I think you and I, as we know from years and years and years of friendship and collaboration and working together and serving together, we have a lot of complementary strengths and a lot of odd similarities, like our parallel paths in life are just so bizarre. But I think what's valuable, or at a minimum relevant to point out, is that your intuition is also drawing on data points, though they might not be conscious, because you've had many reps in whatever arena it is that you are participating in, right? Let's just call it life right now. You have a number of reps to where your body is starting to build up some of that memory. Your brain, we know this from neuroplasticity, your brain creates these pathways. And what becomes dangerous is when they become maladaptive pathways. And then you have somebody, hopefully in your life, who can say like, hey, I love you. You really suck at this. This is a maladaptive pathway, right? Let's try to like walk that back and see if we can't, get you on an off-ramp for this. I mean, this is something that we think about an awful lot. I think about an awful lot, especially, with a history of traumatic brain injuries and, all of that kind of stuff that special operators like us tend to accrue over time. There's a lot of work that, we both have done where we have really gained some actionable insights as it relates to that. And so this might be a kind of a little bit of a turn, but maybe not. What I think we find most often with leaders is that there is this process of learning what is a trustworthy instinct or intuition in my role now as a leader that may or may not necessarily be good or be productive for my role right now as a leader. And I think what we see often is that develops because these folks are, like crack shot individual contributors. These folks are like top of the top, right? They're competitors, they're gamers, and they've learned over time. And I'm gonna pull it into my reality. Like I have learned over the time, we learn over time, that these are the things that make you a really great individual contributor. Perfect example, like, I've got to lean in when something's not getting done. I'm going to pick it up and shoulder it. Well, fast forward, 5 years later, and that might have given you a leg up as an individual contributor, that instinct. Yet, when you're in a leadership position, that can start to become dependence upon putting the ruck on my shoulder and doing it myself, and not really delegating the work or incorporating team members. And so I think, it'd be interesting for us to at least explore that for a few minutes and see how we've seen that in our lives and in other people's lives, because we've gotten that pretty regularly.
Yeah, for sure. That's exactly where I was going to go with this. So I'll take the ball here, because I think what you're referring to, there's a sort of a 4-box grid, and I don't know the attribution, and I'm sorry, but it's basically these phases of competence, right? You have this unconscious incompetence, which is basically you don't know that you're not good at it, right? And then you have a conscious incompetence, where you realize you're not very good at it, and then you get to a place where you're consciously competent. So you're better at it, but you're having to really concentrate on it. And over time, you get to this unconscious competence. And that's the part I want to talk about, because, you could get to a place where your instincts or your intuition perhaps are really still just the result of lots and lots of reps and data points, that now you have this sort of unconscious level of competence. So you're calling it your gut, but it may be actually based in a lot of rigor earlier on in your career. So I think that's worth noting, which you pointed out really well there. The other thing maybe to take this forward is to think about blind spots. So you mentioned some things that maybe served you well at one point don't serve you so well now. And I think as a leader and as a decision maker especially, being aware of your potential blind spots is invaluable. And so understanding where you may have some biases based on your own experience, understanding where you may have some blind spots based on whatever exposure you may or may not have had to certain kinds of topics or areas of expertise. I mean, that is absolutely huge. So sometimes maybe the best thing you can do when making really hard decisions is not just to lean on your own, analytical rigor or your own quality intuition. You may also want to have a teammate like you and I have in our business, or anybody that you're working with, or a mentor, where you can say, hey, you know me pretty well. I'm thinking about this. What else should I be thinking about? Or what am I not including in my decision-making criteria that maybe I should? You don't necessarily have to ask someone to make the decision for you. I wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah.
But it may be helpful to say, hey, I'm going to even step outside my own analytical capabilities and my own intuition and get a third party or a fourth party to get another perspective on this and say, hey, those are all good points, but you're actually forgetting this altogether. So I'm not trying to duck the question of either or, but I think we've already established it's never just either or. That's a layer I'd like to add in there, which is, hey, get some additional perspective because you've probably got some blind spots.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And, something that we have lived our life by, lived our professions by, share with people all the time is, look, leadership is hard. And for many, many years, the axiom, leadership is a lonely place, has been ubiquitous. But it doesn't have to be.
No.
It doesn't have to be. That's actually not true. I mean, it is true if you choose to prescribe to that approach. It can feel lonely at times when you have to make those tough decisions. Sure. And how are you developing that bench, so to speak, of people who can speak into your life? How are you developing that bench of mentors, of supporters, who is it that maybe you're reporting to right now that you can have a trusted relationship with and really invite them in to help kind of just ask some good questions, really just kind of interrogate so that you can uncover some of those blind spots. And, the very nature of blind spots is that you ain't going to find them on your own. That's the point.
Because you are blind to them.
Because you are blind to them, right? Like, yeah. So, I mean, how do you actually, not how, but who?
Yeah. Probably who for the most part.
Yeah. Who are you going to? And I will say, like, if you don't have that who, maybe that's a good growth opportunity. I'll tell you, little story here. So when I went through my grad school program at Denver Seminary, throughout the entirety of the 3.5 years, there was a parallel training and mentoring program. And every semester you had to identify a character growth area or a skills growth area and really work with that. And you would have to develop mentors. You have, ground floor mentors who are right there with you, or balcony mentors who are kind of overwatching the process. And it was actually one of the things that really drew me to the academic journey at Denver Seminary. And I had this experience where, going from my first to my second year, my mentor, who remains my mentor to this day, moved out of state. And one of the requirements was that you got to have somebody that you meet with face to face, like your ground floor mentors. They can be people who are virtual, but it's really important to have that human connection, which I totally agree with and I really value. And I found that very difficult. And so Nathan Scherer, who was my professor who guided me through those 3.5 years, he and I were having a conversation. I said, hey, look, we live in a virtual world now. Can I just, can we be cool? Can I just, can Will and I still do this over virtual? And he said, no. He said, perhaps what is so, disjointed inside of you about this, perhaps why your gut is talking to you right now, because my gut was talking to me. I was like, no, I don't want to, I have my person. I don't want another person.
Yeah.
Nathan rightly pointed out, let's process that. Let's interrogate that, because what we might find is that this is actually a character growth opportunity, which is to expand your willingness to trust others. And look, there are reasons why, I have difficulty with that, right? Just in the way that I grew up. My dad took off when I was 11. You have trust issues, right? You wonder, can I trust you, or can I trust me with you? And I think that, it's good to be willing to kind of interrogate that. Oh, and by the way, my intuition was saying, no, I don't want to do that. No, just see if you can negotiate around it. But I think that it was important to really lean into that and see if that was, what I would say either is a trustworthy instinct or an untrustworthy instinct. And the point being is that, yes, my body was talking to me. Yes, it was rejecting it. And yes, it was more than anything. Nathan was right. It was an opportunity for me to grow as a leader and as a person, because frankly, I was operating out of my fears, my insecurities, my past, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think that happens all the time. And it's great having someone you can lean on to be able to do that. And I would say the inverse of that, I think, happens pretty regularly too, where you can feel yourself wanting to make a decision. It's usually probably the hard decision, right? But you get the pro-con list out in the spreadsheet, and you can figure out a way to make the other route work, And so maybe based on the analysis, you think, I can make this decision over here. But as you try to pull the trigger on that decision, there's something in your gut that says this still does not feel like the right decision. And it's entirely possible that there are things you've missed, or there are things that, matter that can't be measured cleanly in there. And there's something that's telling you to make this other decision. And I think that's worth kind of listening to as well. And that's where someone to lean on can help you also, because I know my wife is big time this way for me. I'll be wrestling with something and I'll talk to her a little bit about it, and she'll just kind of call me and say, you're trying to make that work, but I think you know what you need to do. And sometimes it's just that little bit of a poke in the eyeball, and I'm like, you're right. You're right. And I find that's really true if it's a hard decision, or for me, if it feels like a selfish decision. If there's a decision I need to make, but making it would feel selfish to me, boy, I can rationalize my way to anything else. And sometimes she'll just say, hey, or you will, by the way, you'll say, I think you know what you need to do here. And I'm like, oh, you're right. I do.
Yeah.
I'm overanalyzing.
Yeah. I mean, and likewise, and you are the same voice in my life. And so is Kelly, in my life, where you kind of know, and I think you're taking us into an interesting direction, which is, what are some things that you think about, or maybe experiences that you've had where you've had to make a difficult decision. You know it's the right decision. You know, your guts talk to you. You've done the work, and you don't want to do it.
Oh yeah, all the time. All the time these things happen. And I'll just layer in one other thing here to that same point, which is there are going to be times where you make a decision and it doesn't go the way you'd hoped. And so you may want to reject whatever that decision-making process was because the result wasn't there. So I do think it's worth pointing out that it's one thing to make the best decision at the time with the available information. It's another thing for that decision to work out poorly or well. And I think sometimes we have to be careful about that. So yes, we need to look back and say, how have we made decisions in the past and how have those turned out? Absolutely. But we also have to make sure that we understand there's a difference between because sometimes you can make what was probably the best decision. Let's stay away from wrong or right, maybe. You could make what was the best decision to make in that moment, and it still didn't work out well because the weather changed, the circumstances changed, the market changed, the enemy got a vote, etc. And I find, for me, that's when it's the hardest to go back and make a decision in the same way, knowing that maybe I did that before and it didn't work out so well. So I think there's probably lots of examples of that, but that for me is what I really have to remember is that I can't be afraid to make what I think is the best decision now, even if a similar decision in the past or a similar process toward a decision in the past didn't end so well.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the most common difficulties as leaders is, I guess I'll layer in a little deeper on it, is oftentimes our decisions are a matter of trade-offs rather than anything else, right? Like we're in the midst of the trade-offs, and you can make it super simple, right? Like, you know, do I eat a bowl of ice cream every night because ice cream makes me happy? Or do I make the trade-off because I know that that's bad for my health over long term, or, you know, bad for my cholesterol, all that kind of stuff, right? So in that regard, you know, I've decided for myself, I don't want to live a life without ice cream. So I allow myself a bowl of ice cream every Sunday, and man, that bowl is heaping and it is amazing and I love it. And I'm okay with that, right? And I don't eat ice cream every night. Why? Because it's not good for me. I know that. You know, I'm in my mid 40s now, and that's just the way it is. But that's a trade-off, right? And I'm not going, you know, Spartan on it and saying I'm never going to eat ice cream again. In fact, you know, I know this is probably a little bit of a silly anecdote that I'm talking about here with ice cream, but you know, whatever, I'm going to stick with it for at least a couple more moments here, because when my mother-in-law passed, one of the things that she had shared with Kelly in kind of her last days, she passed at a very young age, she was 53, is she said, I wish I would have had more chocolate sundaes. I love chocolate sundaes. I spent all my dang life worried about my weight and, you know, all of these things. And, you know, and she wasn't overweight. She was, you know, she was healthy. And I just think about that all the time. And that's why I say, like, I don't want to live a life without ice cream. I enjoy ice cream, right? But that's a trade-off. I think, as silly as an anecdote as that might be, or maybe it's silly but relatable to more than just me, it's, you talk about like making decisions, and you make a decision with the best information that you have at the time in the hopes that it will yield the best possible outcome. That is by definition where wisdom comes from, right? You know, understanding or knowledge is all data, right? Wisdom is kind of the application of information into a given situation to prospectively yield a best possible outcome. And then you lean into understanding, which is, I understand how to do this because I've done it enough times, right? And honestly, just like you said, sometimes you make the best decision you could have made. You make the best possible trade-off you could have made under suboptimal conditions, because guess what? Life is replete with suboptimal conditions. And sometimes it goes well and sometimes it doesn't. You know, yeah. and you recognize that it's a trade-off. And I think that what you're advocating here is, just because you made a decision and it didn't end up the way that you thought it was going to, maybe don't be so quick to say, I made the wrong decision. Maybe see what you can learn from it. Oftentimes, it's not all bad, because much in life is not so binary, right? Like, when we say it didn't go the way I wanted to, well, maybe it was like a 60%. Maybe it was a 60-40 and we wanted 100%, but come on.
Yeah.
Is really, I think what you're suggesting is, let's suspend judgment on that and really process, what were the factors? Why did I make that decision? What could I learn? And how can I continue to refine my decision-making skills, my instincts, that intuition, my processing power, when I go into the next one? I think that's knowing you. That's what you're advocating.
Sure. I mean, I think we always say a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, right? So, you want to learn from a decision, whether it was a good one or a bad one, or whether the result was good or bad. I mean, being able to go back and look at what were the circumstances, what did we decide, what maybe did we not know at the time, what can we learn from it to be better next time? That starts to build those instincts that we've kind of talked about. So I think that's really all you can do. Otherwise, you kind of go crazy as well. I mean, I think there are two things that we tell leaders all the time that I think are really true. One of them is you can't manage your way out of leadership. And what we mean by that is there's just not a checklist or an algorithm or a flow chart you can design for every possible scenario in the world. At some point, leadership is really about being as good as you can be when things go off script. How are you when things are not going according to plan? That's really leadership in and of itself.
The shit that wasn't in the brochure.
Right, yeah. Well, how do you deal with the shit that wasn't in the brochure, right? So I think that's something that we do have to embrace, is we can't just kind of analyze our way out of having to make a tough call or use our intuition to, hey, it's a 60-40 and I'm just going to have to go with what I think is the best call here. So that's really important, And the other thing that you really brought up here was that there are no solutions, only trade-offs, right? There's not a perfect solution to almost anything. I mean, most of the stuff that we're dealing with as leaders or in our lives even, there are multivariate optimization problems. And there's no way you can get to like the right solution that's going to optimize for every variable. You're just going to have to decide, which ones do you want to weight more heavily? What risks are you willing to take? I mean, This is the world we live in. There's no kind of right way to do it. I would sort of sum up here. I'll kick it back to you maybe to wrap us up, but I would sum up kind of what I've heard here is a few kind of key points maybe folks can take away. And one of them is it's really not head or gut. It's both. So, use them both to your advantage. I would say maybe understand which one you tend to lead with and go ahead and do that and check it with the other one. The other thing we talked about was have other people around you that can help to keep you right, give you additional perspective and things along those lines. And maybe the fourth point is you have to make the best decision you can at the time with what you've got and focus on making quality decisions, assess the results, but don't conflate a quality decision with a quality result because they're oftentimes, misaligned.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great summary. I think there's only maybe two things that I will add. A lot of this, we spend a lot of time at the lab with stuff like this. We'll drop a blog in the show notes that we wrote a number of years ago on trustworthy instincts that at least kind of give a bit of a framework for how you can really quantify, acknowledge, process, compare, decide, and reflect, things like that. The last thing that I would add is probably just a note on trade-offs. And when we're making those decisions, there's no scripts, right? We all know there's no scripts. There's frameworks, there's ideas. I think something that we have found that will be very helpful is some of your biggest assets, when you're engaged in that trade-off process. Number one is purpose. What is the purpose that you're driving towards? Whether it's mission purpose, goal alignment, all of these things. Two, discipline comes into a big play here when it's talking about trade-offs. And I think that it's fair to note that those are often in conflict with aspects like emotion and comfort. And it's very easy to drift towards comfort, but remember that nobody drifts into growth.
All right, this has been a great one, and you gave us some stuff there at the very end that I think we can chew on probably in future episodes. But if you've got a question or something you'd like for us to discuss, something you're curious about, send us a note. Contact@appliedleadershippartners.com. We'll read all of those emails. We'll take all of your suggestions. We'll read all of your questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can here on the podcast. So until next time, see you soon.